So with us today, we have Connor Ryan, and Connor is actually the rhododendron collection manager for Holden Forest and Gardens. His primary responsibilities are the curator of that rhododendron collection. That was the breeding program based on Dr. G. Leach Research Station. He's housed in Madison, Ohio. He has a broad interest of woody ornamentals, plant breeding, evaluation, plant propagation, and XC2 conservation. I'll let him tell you what that is. Before coming to Holden, Connor earned his bachelor's degree in plant science from Auburn University and his master's degree in plant breeding, genetics, and genomics at University of Georgia. So I will turn it over to Connor Ryan for his presentation on rhododendrons of Northeast Ohio.
Thanks a lot, Tom. It's good to be here. It's bizarre because I moved here in mid-April of 2019, and I think it's basically 50% of my time living in Ohio has been in a pandemic, and so it's been an interesting experience. I'm originally from the South, and so I think I'm a little green when it comes to rhododendrons, but I also have this job where I just think about rhododendrons 100% of my time. And so happy to share with you what I've learned and what we're up to at Holden for rhododendrons. Let's see, it's not, okay, there we go. So if you're in Lake County, you're probably familiar with Holden Forests and Gardens, but if you're not, it's this real enterprise. It's the Holden Arboretum plus the Cleveland Botanical Garden plus the David G. Leach Research Station. The Arboretum and Botanical Garden combined in 2014. And now we're technically the 12th largest public garden in the United States by area. And within that, we have about 60 acres dedicated to rhododendron cultivation and display and research, which is kind of a disproportionate amount of land dedicated to rhododendrons, but we're really just that interested in rhododendrons. So the Arboretum is in Kirtland, rural Lake County. The Botanical Garden is in Cleveland, and the David G. Leach Research Station is about a mile south of Lake Erie in Madison. And at Holden, we've been invested in rhododendrons for quite a long time. Our collection started in 1940. So last year really marked the 80 years of rhododendron collection. And up to this point, we now have almost 1,900 rhododendrons in our collection, more than 750 different types of rhododendrons, 54 unique species. And our collection's really been shaped by a number of regional hybridizers, and especially local hybridizers like David Leach and Tony Sciamarello and Peter Gerard and Paul Bosley. We just have a number of plants in our collection from these people, and as the collections manager, it's my job to kind of steward this history and these plants and try to share with people all of these interesting plants in our collections. And rhododendrons are kind of complicated, so I figured I didn't know who was going to be here, so I figured I'd just do a quick rundown of the different types of rhododendrons. So broadly, there's, I guess, what you call the true rhododendrons, and those, I would say, are the ones that aren't the azaleas. So there's the small leaf or lepidote rhododendrons, which are, PJM would be a good example of the lepidote ones, and they have scales on the backside of their leaves. That's how you tell them apart from anything else. So if you flip a leaf upside down, if you have good eyes, you can see the scales. If you don't have good eyes, you can put it under a hand lens or a microscope and see them, and that's what they look like here. Then you have, I guess, what you call your typical, or what people think of as a rhododendron when you say rhododendron, like English roseum with this big ball of a truss. Big cluster of flowers. Then you have azaleas. Let's see, is it gonna go? You have azaleas, and you have two different types: evergreen azaleas and deciduous azaleas. Evergreen, as you might expect, are evergreen or more or less evergreen up here. And Renee Michelle might be a good example. And deciduous azaleas lose their leaves in the winter. This is the only type of rhododendron that loses its leaves. And Arnis and Gem might be a good example of a deciduous azalea. And so we have this huge history of rhododendrons in Northeast Ohio, probably starting with Paul Bosley, Bosley Nursery in Menor. And he worked closely with Charles Dexter, who was a prolific hybridizer in Massachusetts. And he would go visit Dexter, take a carload of plants back, plant them out at his nursery, and let the winners sort out which ones are good. Maybe his most famous one is Edith Bosley, which is a pretty dark purple that he bred himself. You have other folks like David Leach here, who created Capistrano. That's probably his most famous rhododendron introduction. Other people like Pete Gerard here, and Tony Chamarello. Tony Chamarello might be best known for something like, he has a number of evergreen azaleas, but also Bessie Howells or Holden or Yaku Prince. And then Pete Gerard, who was probably best known for his evergreen azaleas. And these are all folks that were creating rhododendrons really in the Lake County, Cuyahoga County, Ashtabula County area. And of most significance to Holden is David Leach. David was an eminent horticulturist, originally from Brookville, Pennsylvania, but following a disastrous fire at his home in the late 60s, decided to pack up and move to, actually he was trying to decide whether to move to Western North Carolina or Ohio, Northeast Ohio. And the story goes that he was in Ohio looking around and was about to call it quits. And at the last moment, he hired a plane and flew over the banks of Lake Erie and saw a piece of property in Madison. He said, I have to have it. And so he bought it and moved his whole rhododendron collection from Brookville, Pennsylvania to Madison. And that's what is now the David G. Leach Research Station. And he developed an agreement with Holden Arboretum so that in 1987, the property was essentially gifted to Holden, and Holden just had to maintain this Leach rhododendron hybridizing project. David also wrote the book on rhododendrons at the time. It was published in 1961, but it's for a while was the Bible for rhododendrons. He was just a world-class rhododendron expert. And so now we have this rhododendron breeding program at Holden. And for David, started with David in Pennsylvania and then Ohio, and he was really interested in developing highly ornamental but cold hardy rhododendrons for our area and beyond. And most of his material really, if you look at the pedigrees of most of the plants that he's developed, you can find one of these three plants in most of them. Fabia, a white form of Rhododendron catabians, which is our native catabians, and Russell Harmon, which is a naturally occurring hybrid between two of our native rhododendron species, catabians and maximum. And I just want to kind of show you what we're working with, because he was pretty prolific. He named about 160 rhododendrons, introduced about half of that. And so we have plants like Edmund Amateus here, which is this white, just a truly beautiful, it was also a pretty big plant, Spellbinder, which is a very foreign, almost species-like. It doesn't really look like a lot of the rhododendrons you see. And it has the flower bud, this is an unopened flower bud here, is about the size of a golf ball. I mean, a racquetball. It's just giant. A number of plants with really complex colors, so not just purple and not just pink, but some other stuff, other colors mixed in, like Rhea, where you've got this pink with a yellow blotch, or Blazing Sun, which also has a bit of a yellow blotch to it. Janet Blair, which is questionable whether it's actually a leech plant, but it's among his best. It's pretty well adapted here, grows well pretty much everywhere at Holden, and also has this pink, white, and yellow and brown going on in one flower. Vivi, which is another one that I think hasn't gotten out very much, but just a giant mound of a truss, or a truss is a cluster of flowers on a rhododendron. Yak hybrid, so Rhododendron yakushimanum is most famous for having this very fuzzy leaf underside called indumentum, and he developed and named a number of them. Crete, which I still see sold occasionally, Mist Maiden, Pink Parasol. Others like Vernus. Vernus is actually one that he worked with Tony Chamarello on. Tony Chamarello made the cross, and then David grew it out and selected it. I think this one's nice, but it blooms really, really early. Another one, Bravo. I like that he called it Bravo with an exclamation point, like he's patting himself on the back for how good of a job he did. But it is truly a beautiful plant. We have this mass of them planted around a black locust tree. Other plants like Summer Glow, he actually has a whole series of summer blooming rhododendrons. They bloom maybe a month after most rhododendrons. Red Sea, which is a sibling of Red River, if you know Red River, but this really beautiful bicolor white center with a pinkish margin on the flowers. True reds like Singapore and Samoa. Madras and Burma, which are also true red in flower, but genuinely terrible plants. They don't know which way is up and down and left and right. But if you're going to grow a plant for truss alone, it would be Madras or Burma. And I think what he was really sought was getting colors like yellow and orange into a cold hardy background. So you have plants like Savannah, which he never released, but it has this great orange buds fading to yellow. Borneo, which is genuinely orange. Capistrano, which is probably his most famous rhododendron. Some people call it Crapistrano because it doesn't really perform all that well, but it is cold hardy and it is yellow. And because we did acquire this whole project and facility from David, we also have a number of unnamed plants that for whatever reason didn't make the cut, but are still quite ornamental, like this unnamed hybrid that we actually use a lot for breeding. And rhododendron is a genus of like 1,000 plants, and so it isn't hard to imagine that some places of the world maybe it could be a tree, and there are parts of India where India and China where the overstory is a rhododendron. And so David made use of some of these species to develop tree type rhododendrons. Holden Spring Herald is one. This is the original Holden Spring Herald, and we still have it. It's really quite an exceptional plant. Ceylon, another one, just amazing. And Summer Snow, which is maybe the king of the castle at the Leach station, maybe 20, 25 feet tall, blooms the end of June with white flowers, and then the floor on the ground, once the petals have fallen, you just get this summer snow, I guess, on the ground. He also dabbled in deciduous azaleas, mostly using a species called Rhododendron cumberlandense, which is from the Appalachian Mountains and the Cumberland Mountain in southern United States. Also, they bloom a little later than your typical early deciduous azaleas, but they're all quite ornamental. And he also developed his own later blooming series of July blooming rhododendron azaleas. July, Joy, Jingle, Julep. Anyway, there's 6 of them, and they're not all that different from each other. I like Jingle because it's fragrant. And they all have Rhododendron prunifolium SD Coleman as one of the parents. And this is a species that blooms quite late. And then lastly, he made a selection of the pink shell azalea, Rhododendron vasei, which is, I think, not all that different from the wild type, except that the flower petals are exceptionally dark for a vasei. So we like that a lot about it. And so we have this huge body of work from David. It's really about 50 years of breeding. And most of them have faded from the industry for various reasons. I would say that they're not all great plants. I would say that they're all quite hardy and all quite ornamental. And if anyone's interested, you're welcome to come to the station. We can chat about them. But so David died in 1998, and then his successor, Steve Krebs, who maybe some of you have met, took over the breeding program. And Steve actually just retired in September. And so I am now this next part of the program. And so as someone who's, new to the program, kind of new to rhododendrons, it's like, well, why are we breeding rhododendrons? What's so great about them? And I think this is from the USDA Census of Horticultural Specialties. And for broadleaf evergreen, total profits and sales, this is wholesale and retail. You have azaleas and rhododendrons, and the top 5 for broadleaf evergreens. We made almost $100 million in sales for azaleas, almost 40 million for rhododendrons. So we're still selling a lot of them. And they really have that name recognition that I think people are after. And it's hard to beat a rhododendron in full bloom. I think something amazing to me is that if you combine azaleas and rhododendrons, they make up 3% of all sales for nursery stock. That's including deciduous trees, deciduous shrubs, conifers. 3% of all sales if you include azaleas and rhododendrons. So there's still some demand there, and there's still places that they could be improved. And locally in Ohio ranks in the top 10 for states in total sales or money made from sales for both rhododendrons and azaleas. I mean, we're not really keeping up with places like Oregon and Alabama, but there is a place in Ohio for these plants. And so then if we're like, okay, yes, it's still worthwhile to breed rhododendrons. It's like, well, can we do better than the ironclads? Or ironclads are these plants that Ernest Wilson said do well in Boston. And then, so there's this list of 12 or more. And then there's a number of plants that are very similar. Plants like Nova Zembla, Rosium elegans, English Rosium, Catabianus grandiflorum, Catabianus basalt, all of these plants that aren't all that different from each other, and all of these plants that are just ancient. Nova Zembla was hybridized in 1902. So we're talking about a plant that's almost 120 years old. These other plants were hybridized like pre-1850. So plants that are over 170 years old. And it's just amazing to me that these are the ones that are still being grown. And, you know, doing some propagation at Holden, I understand why. I mean, these root-like weeds, they're pretty vigorous. It's understandable, but it's just amazing to me that even after decades of people breeding rhododendrons, these are the ones that people are still growing. And I think one of the things that they really benefit from that other parts of the world don't benefit from is rhododendron ponicum in their background. Rhododendron ponicum is a species, it's a European species native to the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal, and then also the Caucasus. And it's an invasive species in the UK. It just takes over. It's very vigorous. And I think it really, whatever makes it an invasive species in the UK, I think makes them tough plants in the United States. And so then what's next? So David died in 98, and Steve Krebs took over after David. And complaints of the Leach hybrids that I hear are like that they only really grow well in Madison, at his place in Madison, or that they don't have great leaf retention, or they're susceptible to diseases. And so Steve kind of embraced that and said, well, how can we address this? And one way is through multi-site trialing. So the way we breed is we make our crosses in Madison, or grow seedlings in Madison and plant them in evaluation beds, and make ornamental selections. And then we'll take these ornamental selections and plant them in Kirtland at the Arboretum at a site that we call Lower Baldwin, which is very exposed. It's in a frost pocket. In 2015, it got to -28 degrees. It's very exposed. And in Madison, the soil is sand, whereas in Kirtland, it's a gravel loam. So there's a bit more clay in the soil. And so you have, I think, more disease pressure because there's more water in the soil. And then on occasion, we'll send plants to Louisiana. We have a partnership with Plant Development Services Incorporated, who they manage the Southern Living Plant Collection. And this is Buddy Lee, who invented the Encore azaleas. And so we'll occasionally send plants to them to trial, because we figure if we have a lot of disease pressure in Ohio, Louisiana, where it's warmer and more humid, has even more. And so if a plant can survive down there, odds are good that it's a tough plant. And Steve's focus was really on developing root rot resistant rhododendrons. So if you grow a rhododendron, you've probably experienced root rot, maybe not personally, but your plants have. And essentially what happens is this disease colonizes the roots and makes its way up to the crown of a plant and just clogs the vascular system, so that a plant goes from looking essentially healthy, green, and then it gets to a point where it can't take up any more water because the vascular system is clogged, and it just goes into this permanent wilting dead state, and that's the end of your rhododendron. And so the thought was, well, if we trial in multiple places and we develop rhododendrons that are resistant to root rot, maybe we can have more successful rhododendrons for folks. And so we screen for Phytophthora susceptibility and resistance using disease screens either in a greenhouse or in field. And so what we've done in the past is dig out holes where we'll put seedling populations of thousands of rhododendrons. And we know that the disease is present in the field, and then we'll flood it and leave it flooded for 2 days. And that allows the disease to colonize roots. And then you just kind of wait and see what dies. And if you have a segregating population, you'll have some plants that will die and some plants that will survive. And we'll say that these ones that survived are probably resistant. And then we'll pot them and grow them on for ornamental evaluations. And so where do we get sources of resistance? There are a number of sources from cultivars. Maybe Caroline is the most famous cultivar that has resistance, but there are many. Vernus is one. Samoa is a Leach hybrid, that's one. But the one that we like the best is Ingrid Melquist. It's a Gus Melquist hybrid from the University of Connecticut. It has a number of things going for it. One is it's very, very resistant to root rot, especially in our area at least. It also is compact. It's like home size. Some of these plants like English Roseum and Catabians Persalt are enormous plants. But Ingrid Melquist is quite compact. It also has these very, very dark green leaves. And a truss it's pretty nice truss. It's pink that fades to white, very tight. And so we use Ingrid Melquist a lot. Another source of resistance is a species from Taiwan called Rhododendron hypererythrum. And Rhododendron hypererythrum is from Taiwan, and so you'd say, what's a plant from Taiwan doing in Ohio? But it turns out that it's like marginally hardy here. It's probably a zone 6 plant, and so our worst winters will kill it to the snow line. But it'll persist, and really it's the best known source of resistance so far. It's very sun tolerant, it's very heat tolerant, and it's very resistant to root rot. And here's the plant itself. It has these unique leaves. They fold. They're kind of curved, which is maybe, I don't know if it's a plus or a negative. It's interesting. It's a textural difference for a rhododendron. I like it. And it's very floriferous, so it'll get completely covered in flowers. I'd say a few drawbacks are that it is marginally hardy, and so you don't get the full hardiness that we're after. The flowers are also, they're pink and they fade to white, which is not bad, but not necessarily that interesting. They're also, the petals are very thin, so they don't hold up super well in heat or sun. But otherwise, it's a great plant, and it's good for passing resistance on to its to hybrids. So for example, this is following a disease screen where you inoculate. We inoculated Rhododendron hypererythrum, open pollinated Rhododendron capistrano seedlings, and then a hybrid seedlings between the two. And over time, basically all the open pollinated capistrano seedlings died, whereas only 25% of the Rhododendron hypererythrum seedlings died. And the hybrid, this line here, you get about 50% survivorship for plants that are 50% Rhododendron hypererythrum. And so we've been really using this plant for breeding. And here's some first generation hybrids. Steve made a lot of crosses in 2005. I think he grew out like 2,400 seedlings. And we ended up with a number of really ornamental plants. With the problem is that the hardiness isn't fully there for our area. I think if we keep having winters like last year and this one so far, they would be fine. But I mean, 2015 did a number on the rhododendrons, and I think even -15 or -20 would do too much damage for them to be confidently sold here. But they are quite ornamental. Another issue is that this is a bit of an outlier, but you don't get a lot of complex or deep colors. It's that pink fading to white of Rhododendron hypererythrum kind of dominates. And so these are among the best that we found, but most of them are some variation of pink fading to white, and the petals are still pretty thin. So we're moving on to onto the next generation. I think we're pretty optimistic that in the second generation, where their plants will be 25% rhododendron hypererythrum, we'll be able to maintain that resistance, but also get cold hardiness and more interesting colors. I also want to point out this one. This is one, the flowers are no good, but it's like a foot off the ground. It has these really tiny, narrow leaves. It kind of reminds me of like a hedgehog or something. I like it a lot, and I'm going to try to make some crosses on it this year. And I spent a lot of time talking about large leaf rhododendrons, these Elepidotes. I wanted to pause. First, yeah, and this is Steve, who created most of these hybrids. And this is the one introduction that we have from those rhododendron hypererythrum hybrids so far. It's marketed in the South because it probably is a zone 6 to 9 plant, but just really tough. And we have a number in pots. If anyone wants one, I'd be happy to share. But probably not. I wouldn't feel that great about selling it up here. But so I just want to pause and talk about a few other types of rhododendrons, just because it's trying to cover rhododendron as a genus, which is maybe hard to do in one talk. But for our reason, it's interesting to me that we haven't really had any real big innovations in genus rhododendron for our area in the last 50 plus years. It's like everyone's still growing the Gables and the Gerard and hybrids, or these ironclads that are 170 years old. But I mean, they're good plants, so I understand why you're not. But it's just interesting that there hasn't been any real development in a while. But as far as evergreen azaleas go, yeah, as a breeder, I'm interested in where they got their cold hardiness, and they really get cold hardiness from two different species: Rhododendron camphori, which is a Japanese species they call the torch azalea, and Rhododendron yedoense, which is Korean. It has these giant, pretty large purple lavender flowers, and these are zone 5, maybe zone 4 plants, especially yedoense. But Joe Gable really used a lot of these. He's a central Pennsylvania hybridizer. Stuart Stonian, Rosebud, these two are some of his most popular ones. Karen's is another one. I would say, yeah, maybe a little less refined because they're not that removed from the wild species. But when you have an azalea just in full bloom, and maybe it doesn't matter so much because it's just a massive red. And I think these are probably a little cold hardier than like the Gerards. Another one that we like at Holden are the North Tisbury hybrids. These are from Polly Hill in her Arboretum in Martha's Vineyard. Most of them bloom early, but we've got these two at Holden that bloom maybe a month later than most of your evergreen azaleas, Marilee and Alexander. Very compact, maybe a foot, 2 feet off the ground, but covered in blooms. And if you're interested in an evergreen azalea that blooms a little later than most, these are certainly interesting and we like them. Tony Chamarello has a number of evergreen azaleas. I would say also relative to the Gerards, maybe a little less refined, but still quite ornamental. Elsie Lee, red, white, red, Helen Curtis, also good for all these are good for our area. And of course the Gerard hybrids. I was looking through some nursery catalogs before I made this talk, and it seems like Gerards are among the most common evergreen azaleas sold up here. What I wanted to talk about too that I don't see a lot in catalogs, one is Unsurpassable and one is Caitlin. Gerard's Unsurpassable. I mean, you got to have some real confidence in your plant to call it Unsurpassable. But I mean, look at this one, and you can't even see a leaf on this. I was pretty amazed when I saw this one in bloom this spring. And so I'm happy to share if anyone's interested, but I like this. I like these Unsurpassable. And then Gerard's Caitlin, I was reading it was Peter Gerard Jr.'s last azalea selection, introduced in 2006, so relatively new, but it has this nice apple blossom, white and pink flower at the same time. I think it's just different for azaleas in our area. And then lastly, for evergreen azaleas, I wanted to just mention this species. I think some of these are probably hybrids with the species, but it's a species it's the Rhododendron cayusianum, which is from Kyushu Island, Japan, the southern island of Japan. And there's just these very compact, maybe a been saying this a lot, I think, but 1 or 2 feet off the ground, and they just get completely covered in flowers. I really like this one, Como Kolchan, which has basically white flowers with pink tips. And this is another one that I really like a lot called Daisen Haku, which has mostly white flowers, but every so often you get these purple flowers that show up. And to me, it's just a little intellectually stimulating to see this white plant with white flowers with purple every so often. But these are pretty good for us. And of course, deciduous azaleas. I was saying that there hasn't been a lot of innovations with rhododendrons in our area, and so I feel like I am just kind of telling people what they know already. But they are still beautiful, and there's no reason to not grow a lot of these. Arneson Gem has these giant orange flowers. Number of Gerard deciduous azaleas. This is Crimson Tide, and the Northern Lights. Maybe they would fit into this innovation category. They keep releasing new ones. I think I saw there's one from 2015. So, but they started releasing the Northern Lights azaleas in 1978. So they've been out for a while, but relatively good. I think that the issue with a lot of the early bloomers is that they make use of a species from China and Japan, or it's like Molly or Japonicum, and that one tends to be pretty susceptible to powdery mildew. And so you have to watch some of these to make sure you're not gonna have an azalea that's getting a lot of powdery mildew. But an alternative might be this species, which Steve Krebs was very interested in. They call it the Florida Flame Azalea, Rhododendron austrorhinum. Basically grows in the Florida Panhandle into southern Alabama and eastern Mississippi. But just these big plants with almost yellow to almost red flowers, clusters of flowers that are very, very fragrant. And this sailed through 2015 with no problem. So we really like this species a lot. There's a number of selections of it, but also any seedling population would be pretty nice too. For late bloomers, I don't think you can beat the Weston hybrids. They're pretty resistant to powdery mildew. Most of them are fragrant. You have ones like Millennium that have these blue leaves, which is quite interesting to me. You have Lemon Drop with yellow flowers. David Leach has a similar series I mentioned earlier, the July series, that they bloom about the same time, maybe a little earlier, depending on the plant. And I know folks in the area have grown these before. I think Gesture might be the best, but Jingle's fragrant, and I like that about it. And I mentioned Rhododendron prunifolium. So if you're looking for an azalea that blooms in August or September, I mean, this is quite great. And bloom in August, which is a time where you don't see a lot of azaleas or plants in general blooming. And then a few other good doers that aren't Leach hybrids. Yaku Prince, which is a Chamarello hybrid. Chamarello has his royalty series. You have King, Queen, Prince, Princess, Duke, Duchess. I see Prince and Princess the most, which is these floating clouds of pink flowers. A pretty tough plant. Another Weston hybrid is the Olga Meset, which is a similar pedigree to, not the same, but similar to the PJMs, which are also fine. Olga Meset is a sibling of a Glow, if you know a Glow. Maybe a little big of a plant, but I mean, you can't really beat that early spring shrub, just completely covered in pink flowers. And a couple more, or a few more. Angel Powder is a Delp hybrid, Weldon Delp, but the flower, this is a lepidote, so a lepidote like PJM or Olga Meset, that the flowers on it are maybe twice the size of PJM. The plant maybe is twice the size of PJM too, but it's really, really nice, and I would like to see this one grown more. Linda Jean is one that we really like at the station because it's has these almost red buds that fade to a yellow orange. But it does pretty well for us in multiple sites at Holden, so it seems like there's potential there, and it's the color you don't see very often. And cowsap with this immaculate white truss with a maroon blotch, just very ornamental. And then one last one that I really like is Vinecrest. It's a Canadian hybrid, so developed outside of Niagara. So cold hardy, and maybe an alternative to Capistrano. I'd say maybe not as yellow, though it's still pretty yellow. But what it does that the Capistrano doesn't do is it has these brick red buds that fade to yellow. And that's really interesting to me. And so I'm saying there's maybe not a lot new in rhododendron, but what is new? One thing is the encore azaleas, which are taking over the South, have taken over the South. They're rated to, well, I was reading that there's a list of 15 of them that are rated to 6A. And, you know, with the new hardiness zones, I mean, up by the lake, we're technically 6B. So I'm curious to know if anyone's tried these. I think probably hardiness isn't fully there. And I'd be curious to know if they actually rebloom. That's the whole thing with encore azaleas, is that they have an encore. But wouldn't it be nice if we had some for our area? And then with rhododendron, Proven Winners has their own line. They're calling Dandy Man. They have 3 right now: pink, color wheel, and purple. Pink and color wheel are both first generation rhododendron hypererythrum hybrids. So I don't know what kind of vetting they've done. I'd be a little cautious about hardiness, but they're certainly good plants. And color wheel, the trusses, it's almost too many flowers to count in the truss. It's just a big mass of flowers. Purple, it was selected in New Hampshire. So with pink and color wheel, you've probably got a good bit of Phytophthora resistance. I don't know for sure. Hardiness is a little questionable, but might be okay. Purple has a ton of hardiness because it was from New Hampshire and it's quite ornamental, but I don't know about resistance or adaptability. We have all of these if anyone's interested in seeing them. They also have another one called Black Hat, which is an alternative to PJM. It supposedly blooms longer, but it's essentially a PJM type under the Proven Winners brand. Holden has a couple. Holden Spring Herald and Solar Flare were released in the last 10 or 12 years. I'd say they're probably more specialty plants than mass market plants, but interesting. Solar Flare, I struggle to find one that looks good, but the flower itself is amazing. It's got an enormous yellow truss, but I haven't seen one, even at Holden, that looks like a plant you'd want to have in your garden when it's not in flower. And of course, Splendor, which is good, but hardiness is probably not there. We do have a number of rhododendrons in the works. We're working with Briggs Nursery on the West Coast. We're talking about tissue culture labs before this started, but so they've indicated to us that we have a number of rhododendrons with them that they want to move forward with. And so we filed the patent for one of them, this one. We're still in the process of developing a brand, but we're optimistic that we're going to have some kind of Holden rhododendron brand with rhododendrons that have been trialed and tested, and they're root rot resistant and probably more sun tolerant than your typical rhododendron, but also more ornamental than something like English Roseum or Cratabianus Burstall. And when we trial these, we'll make initial selections in Madison and then plant them at Lower Baldwin at Holden at the Arboretum. And when we plant, we don't use subdue, we don't spray anything. We basically just put a cover of mulch down and just see which ones survive. And if 75% or more of the ones that we plant at Baldwin survive, we say, okay, that's a good one. And these have all kind of lived up to that standard. And plus we have a few more in the works, and we're optimistic. And one last thing that I really wanted to cover, since we at Holden, it's a complicated history because these Leach hybrids have mostly faded from commerce, but they are incredibly ornamental, and so we're kind of like, well, what do you do with them? Some of them are tough to grow, and they struggle even in Madison where they were developed. But our thought was, well, you know, in other crops like apples and grapes, they'll graft things onto a rootstock that's adapted to the area, so that you can get an apple that has really great fruit, but maybe the scion isn't super tough. And so that's kind of our thought with grafting rhododendrons. It's really not that hard. So I'm someone who has basically no grafting experience, and I did it for the first time last year and got, 80% take from someone who basically doesn't know what they're doing. And there's really two approaches. You could root a cutting first and then graft, or rhododendrons are kind of unique in that you can root and graft at the same time. And so that's been our procedure. You take a cutting and you as your rootstock, and you take a cutting as your scion, and you kind of tie them together. You make a slice into the cambium on one, you make a slice into the cambium on the other, you tie them together, you stick them under mist for 3 or 4 months. And then usually what ends up happening is you get a rooted cutting that is also grafted. And our thought here is, if you graft onto a more adapted rhododendron rootstock, you could potentially grow some of these really ornamental selections. I don't know how. It might be something that's relegated to the specialty market, but from a collection standpoint, we're interested in preserving some of these really interesting hybrids that are tough to grow, and so grafting is a solution for us. And there are a number of rootstocks available. Rhododendron panicum is the oldest rootstock used. Problem with rhododendron panicum is that it really suckers, and so you can sell a plant to someone, and the first year that they buy it, it's this beautiful rhododendron that they bought, and the next year they buy it, it's a rhododendron panicum. Cunningham's white is kind of the industry standard, and in Europe they do a lot of rhododendron grafting. In the United States, almost no one does it. I think Decker's Nursery in Ohio is the only people that I know of that do rhododendron grafting on any scale. Cunningham's white is good, but it's susceptible to Phytophthora, and so I think there's better things out there. There is a proprietary rootstock that's been introduced in Europe, and it's made it over here, called Incarho. It's actually marketed as being Lyme tolerant. We've done some work makes us think it's probably not Lyme tolerant, but it is very vigorous, and it does seem to be root rot resistant. And so we've done some work with that. It's currently patented, but it is off patent in October of 22. But this is the rootstock that Decker's uses. Other potential rootstocks. So we've done so much work with rhododendron hypererythrum. Maybe rhododendron hypererythrum itself could be a good rootstock, or some of these first generation hybrids that aren't fully cold hardy here, but they are root hardy. Another one that I'm pretty excited about is, with these plants like English Roseum that have been around for 170 years, you end up with multiple different genotypes, different plants under the same name. And I think that's the case for English Roseum. English Roseum also goes by Roseum Pink, but Steve Krebs, when he was at Holden, screened the Holden accession of English Roseum for susceptibility to root rot, and it came back as moderately resistant. And in the literature, there's mention of this Grutendorst strain that was screened by folks at OSU in the 70s that also came back as moderately resistant. And we're wondering if that might be it. But English Roseum is easy to root, and we've been doing some grafting with it, and it's also has been pretty successful with grafting. And so we're doing some of this at Holden. If anyone is interested in talking grafting, I'd be happy to. We're excited about it, at least for the prospects of the Holden collections, but there's greater application potential there. And just for an example, sometimes it's just a benefit of vigor. Holden is a Chamarello hybrid, and here it is self-rooted. Here it is grafted onto Incarho, what's called number 37, and just the size difference is quite amazing. And so there's potential, as a nursery person, to so maybe you're growing Holden on its own roots, and it's easier to root a cutting and not have to do any grafts. But if you could graft it and root at the same time, you could maybe fill a container faster on a grafted rootstock. And this is it. This is one of these plants grafted, growing in full sun at Holden outside of our Rhododendron Discovery Garden. And if you've been to the Rhododendron Discovery Garden, you know that this is a really tough site, and it's still doing pretty well. There's also, as I mentioned, the improved adaptability options. So Capistrano is quite susceptible to Phytophthora. And so we have, I think, 6 pairs of Capistrano on its own roots and grafted at our Lower Baldwin site. And in every single pair, the own root Capistrano has long died. It's been dead for a couple of years. And I think 5 out of 6, the grafted Capistrano growing in full sun in soil with a good bit of clay in it, is thriving. So we think there's a lot of potential for grafting rhododendrons. Just I don't know how receptive the industry is to it, and I don't know how economical it is. But from a public garden perspective, it has me excited. And just some examples of the vigor component. So as I mentioned, we'll graft in October, and then put under mist for 3 or 4 months, pull off mists, and then we'll move it into a heated greenhouse with lights, mostly because we're growing our seedling populations there, and we have extra space, and we'll put some grafts in there. But so these are some grafts from that are less than a year old in a 2-gallon container. And this is Capistrano, and Red Sea grafted onto that, what we believe is a resistant form of English Roseum. And so we just planted them at Lower Baldwin. We're gonna see how they perform in this adverse site. But we're optimistic, and if anything, it's fun. And so we'll keep doing some rhododendron grafting and see how it goes. And so I think that's a bit of a whirlwind tour of rhododendrons at Holden. I will say that as far as a collection standpoint at Holden, we're continuing to do breeding because that's the purpose of the station. We're also kind of interested in plant exploring and trying to increase the diversity of our collections. So trying to acquire wild origin species. So this is that XC2 conservation that I was talking about. So going to native populations in the United States, Ohio has 5 native rhododendron species, and just trying to acquire some of these to conserve them in a garden collection. Just got to figure out how to talk someone into letting me go to Japan. But we're really kind of going all in on rhododendron, but pivoting a little now. So we're maintaining this breeding program, but also trying to add some conservation value to our collections.